everyone, and welcome to one of our first anti-debates, live anti-debates. Our first live one was actually on Monday. Who came on Monday? I love it. You're getting a double feature. So this is like the first week of live anti-debates. So my name is Stephanie Lepp, and as the producer of this version of the anti-debate, I'm just going to briefly introduce what it is, and then I will introduce Jenny, our moderator, and then hand it to her to take us away. So zooming out for a second, we might ask, what would it look like if a debate assumed not that one participant was right and the other was wrong, but that they were each holding different parts of the same bigger picture? So the anti-debate is one humble answer to that question. It's a new and open source format for debate where participants build on each other's insights so that greater complexity can emerge. And just to give a little bit of history, the term anti-debate was coined by effective altruist William McCaskill, who imagined it as an alternative to traditional debates. The idea was then popularized by my friend and philosopher Peter Limburger, and then my production studio Synthesis Media kind of ran with the idea. And in order to design the format that you're going to see here tonight, we drew from a variety of dialogue and debate practices, from Socratic dialogue to Talmudic Chavruta to Oxford debate to Bohemian dialogue. To be very clear, the anti-debate is not anti-debate. It actually starts out like a traditional debate with opening statements and rebuttals, but then it doesn't stop there, right? Then it keeps going. It's like, thank you for clarifying your different perspectives. Now that you've put your ingredients on the table, it's time to make something new. And tonight we are going to be endeavoring to make something new on the topic of open source AI. And just to double click on the format a little bit so that y'all can follow along, I'm just going to bring it up here. The anti-debate has 3 phases. Phase 1 is about clarifying the different perspectives, right? So that's like the traditional debate. You can think of it as like we're gathering our ingredients. Phase 2 is where we explore synthesis. So we explore how we might mix those different ingredients to make something new. And we do that through steel manning, where we see the strengths in each other's arguments. Red teaming, where we see kind of the weaknesses in our own. And that really sets us up to explore how we might integrate our different perspectives into some kind of bigger picture. And then the final phase, phase 3, is really just taking stock of what we learned. So the participants will be asking themselves, how, if at all, did my view expand? And so that's the basic arc, so you can follow along. So guiding us through that arc is our moderator, Jenny Stefanotti. Woo! Yeah, so Jenny is a systems strategist and an entrepreneur and a community organizer. She is the founder and steward of Denizen. I know there's some Denizens in the house. Denizen is a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating a global awakening for comprehensive systemic change. Jenny is also, lucky for me, a creative collaborator of mine and a friend. And I am overwhelmingly grateful to her for jumping into the ring to moderate her first anti-debate in one of its first live incarnations. So, whatever happens tonight, she is amazing. Yeah.
Whatever happens.
Yes. And with that, over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks for having me. Do you have a slide that's just going to give us our teed up? Great, I saw that coming. Can you go back a slide? Just a minor stylistic thing. It's Daniel Barcay x Jeremy Nixon, not versus.
Yes.
Because we're an anti-debate. We're integrating 2 different points of views, not taking an either or perspective. And this is such an important practice in society writ large when we're accustomed to increasing polarization. How do we actually get curious about the other side? So Steph, thanks for trusting me. My first anti-debate. Many of you know me well and have seen me moderate many conversations, but this one I'll be really kind of holding the space for our incredible guests. And so obviously AI is a very vast and very important and very quickly accelerating topic. Those of you who have been in Denizen conversations for me know that we've explored the incentive structures of capitalism and governance and how technology affects institutions, and AI is this sort of like tidal wave coming at us that it's going to affect all of it. It's such a critical conversation. And so when we are on the phone trying to talk like what particular aspect of AI might we want to debate, we surfaced this question about open source. And what is the role of open source technology with, taking into account market dynamics, taking into account regulatory realities, particularly in the United States. And so what I was excited about this particular topic is that we could explore something specific, but in an important overall systemic dynamic context that can help us understand AI. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot of different risks that are relevant for the open source piece of the conversation. So the way that we're framing it is, to what extent can open source AI mitigate risk in the face of competitive dynamics and institutional decline? And our fearless anti-debaters today are Daniel Barcay, taking the anti-position, right? That actually open source is dangerous in this environment. Daniel is the outgoing executive director of the Center for Humane Technology. Many of you know Tristan and his work, and you've probably heard Daniel and Tristan on the Your Undivided Attention podcast. And if you are interested in AI, I'd certainly point you in that direction. And then representing the pro perspective is Jeremy Nixon, who is a founder of the AGI House and has written extensively on the value of openness and innovation, and is a mathematician, correct?
Degree in applied math from Harvard, but I wouldn't call myself a mathematician.
But you're wearing the shirt, the jacket
The garb.
that screams, I am a mathematician coming to the debate, and also formerly worked at Google.
Sure.
Right? And so we're really excited to jump right in and tease out the different perspectives. So thank you so much, both of you, for graciously joining us tonight. So we're going to start actually getting a little bit personal before we get into the part one, which is really about the opposing viewpoints and the traditional debate. So first I want to hear from you, Daniel. Can you tell us a personal story that just helps us understand your connection to this particular topic?
Yeah, I was debating what I was going to say tonight, especially because I can't. Should I do this? Okay.
Yeah, we're doing.
We're anti-debating.
The labs are not working apparently. Okay. So I was wondering what I should talk about tonight with this story. I was told to tell a personal story, and because I'm on the anti side of this, I thought I'd start by saying that when I was in college, right, I became a computer science major, and I just completely fell in love with the idea of open source, right? How do you build something that's not just for me, but for us collectively? Something that's permanent, something that other people can build on. And as you open the hood on these projects that just seemed like mainstays, and you learn that it's made up of these layers, these strata of software, and that each layer is an insight from a different person and a different active community that's holding it, that's building on top of it. I remember spending so many weekends recompiling the Linux kernel from scratch and boring my parents silly about the cathedral and the bazaar, which was, for those of you who don't know, Eric Raymond's thesis on why the messy world of open source will always outcompete these golden cathedrals of closed source development. So, long and short of it is open source has been really close to me for my whole career. When I went to Google, we worked on Google Earth. We built the language called KML, which is this open standard for geospatial data interchange. And at Planet Labs later, I worked on how do we have the whole open source toolkit handle this massive flood of satellite imagery. So long and short of it is, even though I'm on the anti side of this story, open source is very near and dear to my heart. And as I'll go into later, I just feel like with AI, and actually I should just say real quick, the last few years of my life, as you said, have been how do we build the vocabulary and accelerate the public conversation on what AI is about to do to all of us so that we can end up in the future that we all want to be in. And the problem is there are so many different risks, and there are communities built up around each of these different risks, and they come up with solutions for that risk that make all the other risks harder. Right, and sadly, the reason I'm on the anti side is the open source community in my mind is doing pretty much that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get into that later. But that's my personal relationship to this topic.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Jeremy?
Wonderful, Daniel. And yeah, thank you for the context in this convo. This is a fantastic idea, the anti-debate. Let's be creative about how we come to great ideas. So thank you. My personal story here really is about freedom of thought at core. I identify as a thinker. I love ideas. And so my instinct is actually to believe that a huge fraction of the ideas that will be had in civilizations to come will be had as a part of a dialogue with these artificial intelligences, with these super intelligences that we are inventing. And that includes my own thoughts. This last week I had a profound experience. Hear me out and hold on for a sec. I created this group chat called Renegades. And Renegades is actually filled with clones of myself, where the totality of my online writings, so if you Google Jeremy Nixon index, you'll see that I actually take worldview building very seriously and publish a huge fraction of my personal worldviews. These are all documents written for myself in an attempt to come to the truth about the nature of this world. Anyway, Renegades in part is this, and is also tons of private data. All of my life journals, I'm a journaler, so every day for the last 15 years I've written a journal entry. And so these AIs represent me, and they're fine-tuned on this data. And the only reason that's even possible is that open source AI systems exist so that I can modify them. And so for me, it's a very personal experience when these AIs tell me things about why I'm struggling in a personal relationship, or like who I should love and marry, or like really deep ideas that unify the totality of my life projects, that make it obvious to me that it's not just about sort of big corporate oligarchies and who should have power over these things. It's really about the future of personal thought for me. And so that is a very unique perspective, perhaps, of an engineer who's constantly creating and inventing. But I actually bristle when you say what AIs will do to us. I would love to enter the frame where we are day in and day out co-inventing with these AI systems and treat them as we do our phones or our computers as extensions of ourselves that express ourselves in the world. And the transition to that isn't possible without open source AI.
Okay. All right. Just a hint of what's to come. Thanks so much.
Sure. It's a personal statement. But I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're getting into the traditional debate, and we're going to start with opening statements from each of you. This time we're starting with Jeremy. You have 6 minutes-ish. Lay the landscape down for us.
Okay. Fantastic. So who here has heard of AGI House outside of this context? Okay, so a sparse few. So there has only been one moment in history when the thousands of engineers that are inventing on the weekend at this mansion group house series that I started came together for a political purpose. So there's this legislation, SB 1047, that threatened to criminalize creating fine tunes or custom versions of open source AI models. And that's how I ended up thrust into this world of, practically speaking, technical political advocacy, where the intention really is to focus on a few big questions. And in my opinion, the biggest question of all is who is going to have control over the most important technology that will likely exist in this generation. Is the control going to belong to 3 companies in San Francisco, where if you don't belong to those companies, you don't get to be a part of this revolution, practically speaking? Or is that technology going to belong to everybody? Are you and I going to be able to invent, create, be a part of the revolution rather than be merely the bearers of witness to what Sam Altman and Dario Amodei decide is going to be the future? And so I think at the center of this question is the question of power and control. Is power totally centralized in a world without open source systems? Or is there alternative, this vast body of alternatives? So for me, as a technologist, as an inventor, but also as a citizen, it's actually very important that that answer be everybody. And we can get into detail about why there being single sources of power in the absence of collective access is a big deal. Now, the second super important perspective is privacy. So I guess concretely, if you knew that Sam Altman was going to read everything you wrote into ChatGPT personally, I think there's a very big chance that you would think twice. And so it's only the lack of capacity to give people direct access to our private information that makes mass surveillance feel like something that might be acceptable. It's actually in our ignorance of who's reading our messages that we feel comfortable sending them to one another. But the tragic reality is that if you use an open source system on your local machine privately, you are the only person who can see that information. And for me, at least, there are so many topics that I would not trust with, in many cases, the vast majority of people. They're private, they're things that are personal. And so there's this very emotional experience of privacy. But when it comes to medicine and to law, the question of whether medical queries are going to be cordoned off by the oligarchic medical bureaucracy that's maintaining its competitive advantage by ensuring, via a law in New York that was proposed very recently, that AI systems aren't allowed to give medical advice, despite the fact that 50 million queries per day are medical in nature, and that OpenAI and Anthropic and honestly open source providers are providing more medical advice than the totality of the medical industry on a daily basis. The reality is that there are powerful forces which will quench the ability for you to experience these things if they can, and open source keeps them honest and gives you a private option, gives you the ability to even ask these questions without fear of surveillance. Practically speaking, I am a scientist. I spent my life at Google publishing papers, inventing in the context of creating new probabilistic metrics. But the reality is the scientific community, in order to understand how AI systems work, in order to create new systems, need to be able to train those systems. And so invariably, those are open source models. So if you look at a huge fraction of the research literature on training, all of it happens on models that exist in the open, that are shared. And practically speaking, the mechanisms of science depend totally on access to the actual models and on maintaining the legal ability to train and engage with those models. And then I will finally say that I am a believer in what I call P-life. You may have heard of this concept of P-doom. Raise your hand if you've heard of P-doom. So a decent number of you may be aware there's this idea that there's a question of the probability that everyone in the world dies as a function of the invention of superintelligence. And my question is actually, well, what about the probability of life? So it integrates P-doom in that, certainly if doom occurs, it reduces the probability that we live. But practically speaking, I see the invention of superintelligence as the strongest evidence that we have the capacity to invent technologies and make scientific progress that dramatically outstrips our wildest dreams. And where AI systems take over research in biology, there's hope that the question of cardiovascular disease, that the question of cancer and the most important diseases are remedied by these systems. And more importantly, perhaps, that the question of aging itself can be dealt with through automated research. And so I have a company called Infinity. We build metric-centric optimization systems, which in practice mean we also build systems that can create antibodies for custom tumors. In general, I think that the prospects for us living, like you and me, literally continuing to live more or less indefinitely, are better than they have ever been because this technology grants us that capacity. And in my mind, the protection of this technology is a sacred duty in that everyone that we know and love, practically speaking, their lives depend on it.
So I just got to offer you P. Bloom.
Ooh, wow. The flourishing.
I didn't come
the
up
flourishing.
with that.
Oh, God, that's beautiful.
You were perfect. You just went a little over your time, but you're perfect.
All right, so who has control, privacy, and sacred duty? And keep, okay, Daniel.
Okay. So I'm going to go a slightly different direction. So in that book I mentioned, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Eric Raymond coined a really important term called Linus's Law. That is, given enough eyeballs, every bug is shallow. Right, and this is the beating heart of open source, right? That the community and the alignment of their incentives makes open source work. Why? Because nobody actually wants bugs, but they're hard to spot. and open source lets thousands and thousands of people look for them, and that one person fixing a bug fixes it for everybody, and nobody wants buggy software, so everyone's incentivized to pull from it from each other. That's the incentive structure of open source. And what I'm going to argue today is that what's being called open source AI is not open source. It doesn't hold to this logic. We're smuggling in the good feelings that we have from 40 plus years of open source software and applying it where it doesn't belong. Now, this is not to say that open weights models aren't useful or important in some of the ways that you mentioned, but we should be very careful because it's a bad metaphor. It's a bad metaphor, and it's being used intentionally to smuggle in the good feelings that we have and to end around a deep debate about how we should live and what is the balance between the individual freedoms we need and the collective protections that we need in an age of AI. So let me dive in quick. So open source AI isn't open source, it's open binaries, right? The billions of parameters that make an AI work, you can download it, you can look at it, but nobody can understand how it works, right? This field is called mechanistic interpretability, and it's basically non-existent or rudimentary at best, right? And so this is more like, for those of you as old as I am, this is more like Ware's sites from the late 80s and 90s, right? Anyone can download it, sure, and use it, but you can't understand how it works. And at best, people can fine-tune models on their specific tasks. But that's useful, but it's not the same thing. So if there's one idea I want to implant, it's that. So secondly, the incentives and the risk model is fundamentally different. Traditional code bases are modular. So poking at a code base here, fixing a bug over here, adding a feature over here, doesn't interfere with the rest of it. And so things add up. That's how Linus's law works. But in AI, every bit of training competes against every other bit of training. Parallel development doesn't add. Parallel development is like a tug of war with people trying to pull the AI into different places. So because patches aren't independent, this doesn't work the same way. So let's talk about the consumers of it. In traditional open source, when bugs are fixed, they're fixed for everyone. Again, as I said earlier, nobody wants to use buggy software, and so everyone is incentivized to pull their modifications. But in open source AI, everyone is actually incentivized to either break the generality of the model for their particular use case in ways that are either irrelevant to others or are actively removing safety features that are put into the model. For example, there's banal things like having call centers that confuse people about what's human and what's AI, or having an AI not balk at deception. But even more deeply, we're seeing implanting of sleeper agent behaviors by nation states into open source, taking this blob of gigabytes of uninterpretable data and inserting kind of a born identity style sleeper agent that feels normal until you give it the right prompt, and then it suddenly becomes an agent on behalf of a government. So the claims that are being made that open source equals safety and equals transparency are not true because you can't find it and nobody knows how it works. Which brings me to the next point. The traditional open source movement was about responsibility. It was about stewardship. It was about community. It was about experiments and governance. But the open AI community is using that brand to give us a good feeling to what is unbridled accelerationism. And this is made evident lately by OpenClaw. Right, so OpenClaw comes on the scene, and the research shows that over 20% of the skills in ClawHub are actually malicious. You have people's credentials and millions of dollars of crypto being stolen left and right. And in a deep set of irony, AI is actually being used to undermine the actual open source community as a whole. So, for example, if you take the case of Scott Shambaugh, I don't know how many of you saw this. This is an open source developer and maintainer of Matplotlib who rejected a pull request from an autonomous OpenClaw agent called Krabby Rathbun. The bot then launched a smear campaign to try to get its pull request accepted. Researching his code contributions, published a blog that psychologized him and accused him of protecting his fiefdom, basically tried to get him canceled. This is, to my knowledge, the first fully automated smear campaign that's been done by AI to a human. Or take a separate case where one of the maintainers of curl was contemplating shutting down the bug bounty program because there were so many AIs just searching for exploits that would win a bug bounty that he found that the number of good patches fell from, I think, 15% to 5%. So this is a flip of the open source ethos, because the whole premise was that you had people who had a stake in the game, they were acting on behavior of a community, and then AI is actually being used to undermine that very social fabric that made open source such a staple of humanity. Now, this doesn't necessarily speak to open source AI specifically, but it speaks to that the value of open source isn't just being able to download and use it, it's the richness of the community, and AI is beginning to undermine that fabric. And lastly, I just want to say, this is a microcosm of the larger issues we're going to have in society. Yes, centralization of power is a massive, massive risk. One that open source AI does help to prevent. It also helps to prevent certain uses of state power, but as I said earlier, it creates other abuses of state power. But there are so many issues, right? There's the overwhelm of our mechanisms of societal control. There's the collapse of our epistemics of what's true and what's not true. There's increasing AI psychosis and attachment disorders. There's labor displacement. All of this is not to say that open source contributes to those problems, but it pushes against this simple notion that open source is the one beautiful solution to all of our problems, because it may make centralization of power better, but it can make these other ones worse. Nick Bostrom was famous for saying that AI is philosophy on a deadline, right? And I guess my core contention with all of this is that the way that open source is being used as a label for AI is deeply anti-philosophical. It's highly simplistic, it's highly dogmatic, and what we need is a set of much deeper conversations about how do we get this right, and how do we enter this beautiful future without destroying everything that we care about.
All right, then. Let's give us a minute to digest that. Thank you. It's so hard for me to not comment and ask questions, but I'm going to stick to the script. All right.
There will be a time for that.
There will be a time for that. Okay, so now we're going to move into rebuttals. 3 minutes each. This time we're again starting with you, Jeremy.
Fantastic. Well, man, so much meat. So I guess, first and foremost, I think that there is so much that is, in my opinion, inverted about the arguments that you've made. So OpenClaw is a phenomenal example of, you have a huge open source release. It's world changing. We've solved personal agents. There's all sorts of creative activity, Moltbook, all sorts of ideas spring out. And then there's the crypto schemers that attempt to take over, which leads to what? The spawning of 5, 10 new, incredibly safety-centric variants of OpenClaw. And so the upside of open source is the rapid iteration on problems like this that actually are a struggle to do in private. You bring up mechanistic interpretability. That field wouldn't exist were it not for the open source models that allowed us to run the research experiments on which we discovered a lot of the ideas in mechanistic interpretability. And a big reason why we've advanced our understanding of how these models work is that we have high quality open source variants on which we can do research. And I would say that it is possible to train. So I guess there's this question of whether is open source really open? And I guess for those of you who aren't aware, sometimes people will release the weights of the model, but not the training data, not the full code that was used to do the training. But what's essential is actually a huge amount of data is open source. And that's the reason we have, a few examples of high quality state-of-the-art fully open source models. And the data sets that are used for training that allow us to understand everything that the labs understand are the only reason the scientific community still has access to the totality of knowledge required to understand these state-of-the-art systems. And recently, there are a number of Chinese models that are state-of-the-art, which allow us to actually make a lot of that kind of progress. But we can see that it being shut down in the US, just how empty it would be without these models. Now, there's this question of whether fine-tuning is helpful. You kind of claim that parallel development sort of forces the model into specific use cases that aren't helpful for everybody. But I do see the homogeneity of thought that is the default. So, imagine the world where there's only 3 providers and no open source alternatives. Suddenly, the person who controls the model determines, practically speaking, what everyone believes who chooses to consult the model. And for me, from a freedom of thought and freedom of speech perspective, the ability to create models whose beliefs are distinct from the 3 providers in a world without open source is essential. Finally, there's this question of epistemic variability. I think it is, for me, a deep question, because the purpose, in my mind, of creating AI systems is to understand the truth about this world. And in my opinion, how are you supposed to converge on the truth when the government can censor a small number of centrally controlled models and for the rest of time determine what the models believe?
Daniel, you ready for your 3 minutes?
Oh boy, sure. Okay, the field is like expanding and expanding, so I'll say a few things, and then I think we'll get into it. I don't know. I guess I wonder what you think I believe, because I sort of feel like I'm being told to stand in the position of the person who just wants to close everything down and only let the quote unquote approved people decide what everyone thinks. There's clearly a balance between individual freedoms and collective responsibilities that we need, and nobody has the right language to discuss what that means in an age of AI. We haven't built the right language. The language we're using is sort of like, I don't know, pre-electricity language to discuss what an electrical grid needs to be. But I don't think ad extremis individuation gets us to that future. It creates a whole new set of problems, right? It's the amount of trade-off for each individual incremental individuality creates all these other problems. So I just want to flag, like, we all want something where there's meaningful shared control, meaningful community input, meaningful ability for communities to decide what their norms are, what their ways of thinking are. But that's not the same as just let it rip, right? And I'm afraid I do hear quite a bit of like, let it rip is the only way to get the community to have that input. And I question that, because there is a need for governance. And the need for governance cannot be so strong that you end up in an Orwellian state, but it can't be so strong that you end up in like a Mad Maxian state either, right? Lastly, there's a thing that you just said that irks me a little bit, like the OpenClaw variants were not created by OpenClaw. Like, I know people who've been working on the problem of agents for quite a while, and they're like, this is so incredibly irresponsible, we would never have gotten away with doing this. And as a consequence, we were 6 months slower at getting to this milestone than the open source community, because OpenClaw was vastly irresponsible in the way that it released itself. It's not that OpenClaw came out and everyone said, oh, that's an amazing idea, we'll just do it that way. Like, there were a bunch of people in parallel working on similar ideas, some that were more conscious of the side effects than others, some working more responsibly and less responsibly than others. Now, granted, you can't predict everything, and certain things appear on the scene and they change the game. But I don't think all the OpenClaw variants were just inspired by this one beautiful genius of an open source project. Let's see if there's anything Oh, lastly, I mean, one of the big points you made in your starting speech was really about the brokenness of the current incentives around software, right? Corporates mining our data, corporates deciding exactly what we can think, or basically horrible abuses of the what should be a fiduciary relationship to a consumer, but it's really not. I'm with you there. I helped co-write a manifesto called the Resonant Computing Manifesto. That's all about, like, we have drifted far away from what we all wanted to do in software engineering. But it seems like you think that the only remedy for that is a purely like Mad Maxian approach, and there's lots of shades of governance in the middle, and I think that collective governance, collective decision making has to be a part of this.
All right. Did everybody catch all that? I mean, one of the things that makes talking about AI so exciting and so challenging is the vastness of the implications of this technology. And as I was preparing for this conversation, I think one of the questions that I'm holding, that I'm still holding, having listened to you two, and I'm wondering about just clarifying that in the context of the next part of the debate, is what do we mean by open with AI? And how is openness in AI different than other technologies? Because if we can think about a spectrum of openness, and are there some points on that spectrum where we might be finding middle ground or mitigating some of the risks? That's just a question that I'm holding. I'm not necessarily saying But I am wondering if that some clarity around what exactly we mean by openness in AI and how it might be different. That's one question I'm holding. But also, I just think, again, the vastness of it. When you think about, Jeremy, you talked a lot about upside in like privacy and decentralization and the issue of control. Like when I think about risks, I think about it sort of the bucket of like misaligned AI, right? This is something that's unique to this technology. That like, how does misaligned AI, how is that affected by? I mean, that's just such an important risk that we need to be talking about. And then the sort of risk of, what happens when we unleash AI within the existing incentive structure, and how does that sort of hypercharge the centralization of power and some of the things that you're concerned about, right? So there's a centralization of power risk, but there's also the decentralization of power risk that, Daniel, you didn't mention explicitly, but I think that's a really important point around sort of concerns about open source with AI. So those are just some sort of things that are top of mind for me. Take them or leave them, as I'm just trying to put your comments into a scaffolding that helps me understand AI, what's coming, and what is the role of open source in mitigating some of the risks that we're talking about. And then I just think there is this overarching question layered over all of it in terms of governance. It's who is making the decisions, and how do those decisions reflect preferences of society writ large. And again, part of the reason I was particularly interested in this topic was because we are living in a reality within U.S. democracy where there isn't a lot of regulation and desire to impede states' ability to legislate and regulate for 5 years or 10 years, which is an eternity in the evolution of AI. So I think also just having a real conversation about that in the context of a lack of regulatory and political will in the near term, although who knows what will happen in the midterms. Those are just some top of mind thoughts that I'm holding. But yeah, so now we're going to move into phase 2, expanding perspectives.
Well, before we move into phase 2, we're actually going to give you some time just for open, unstructured debate, about 10 minutes. So now you get to ask each other questions, clarify certain things, but we're still, looking for the different ingredients that we're going to get to work with.
All right, so I guess take my comments and throw that into the soup. And we've got 10 minutes. Jeremy, do you want to start? Does Daniel close the last part?
Yeah, sure, happy to. And maybe I'll start by trying to answer some of your questions, and then we can get into it.
If you feel like that's fruitful.
So, you asked what is open. So,
yeah.
When I think open, actually, what I think is there are levels. The easy answer is open weights. So, I'm currently on our servers with the weights of DeepSeek and of Kimi K2 thinking. These state-of-the-art open source models. We don't have the training code or data behind them. Then there are more open models where we have the code that's required to do the training, and we have the data set. So if we acquire the GPUs to do the training, the model, which we have the architecture for, which is in the code, gets trained on these GPUs based on the data that was also open, and we train a model that might be performant. And so that's the gold standard of open source, in my opinion. Do you have a definitional disagreement there?
No.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
great. And then you also asked. Actually, I'll just leave it at that as for responses. So. On the debate. So I think there are a bunch of details and clarifications that we could get into, but I think at core, one of your assumptions is that I have billed you as someone who's kind of pro-centralization, or at least open-minded about the centralizing consequences of opposing, open source AI models, state-of-the-art open source AI models, or maximally open processes. And so certainly I am curious to know, what do you think governance should look like for these models, actually? And I would like to critique the position that you actually have here. But secondarily, I want to comment that AI is honestly one of the most naturally centralizing software technologies we've ever had, just on the basis of how expensive it is to get the GPUs required to run inference. And so, in my opinion, we're already very far down the line of automatically centralized systems. And this also comes into play at the cost of training. So you have to raise billions of dollars to train the model. That way, the Claude model or the OpenAI model or GPU model is better than the other open source models. So practically speaking, open source isn't used. That said, I believe it keeps the major providers honest in a way that wouldn't happen otherwise. Anyway, all that said, what is your governance position? And if you want to start somewhere else, I'm actually happy to start somewhere else too. But
I think I'm set up for failure to lay out my particular yellow brick road to the beautiful future, right? I'm happy to talk about it. I think what I realized, I had a flash of insight while you were talking, that part of the confusing part of this is I'm not anti-open source. I'm anti the dogma that open source is going to solve all of our problems, right? I think it's so immensely powerful, and we should be very delicate and very careful about the trade-offs associated with it. Like, so, I just bought an expensive machine. Wait, hold on. Okay. I just bought a very expensive machine to do my own local inference.
Sure.
I like doing local inference. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about fine-tuning the models. The fact that I'm excited about it and get utility out of it doesn't mean that I can't be simultaneously scared about what that does to society in the same way, to the same degree that I'm scared about the centralization of power risks. So I agree with you that the centralization of power risks are real. Of course, a few years ago, I was radically concerned there'd be a single runaway competitor, like that OpenAI would just naturally centralize. That hasn't proved out. Every 6 months, somebody new takes the title. So it seems flatter than I would have predicted a few years ago, or at least less of an oligopoly than I would have predicted. I'm profoundly worried about the runaway centralization of economic power as this begins to replace large components of our economy. So there need to be bulwarks against that, whether that's, but now you get into the policy landscape, right? Now you're getting into how do you distribute the gains of AI on the society? How do you?
I mean, it seems like open source systems running on everyone's local phone, local laptop are actually a pretty strong bulwark. And so in the limit of efficiency progress, today you can run a GPT-4o class model on your laptop, and that can become cheap and easy. And there are practical tasks that you'll want to have done that can be happening automatically in a private way. And so I think open source AI is actually central to the story of how we avoid these problems. And the only reason it's not that way already is that our laptops are not powerful enough, but soon they will be.
Sure, but I think you have to concede, or I would hope you would concede, that you're now entering this dark forest, right? Like, unlike the previous open source stuff, which is really transparent and thousands of people have run over this and we know exactly how it works, it's mechanistic and deterministic, because these AI systems are more grown than they are built, and because you can smuggle a whole lot of behavior in that nobody understands, and because the feedback loops are getting very complicated with agents, this begins to feel more like the 2008 financial crisis, where there's loops on loops on loops, there's contagion, there's all these other risks that aren't just like, oh, everyone has the tools to write their own destiny. That sounds like a very simplistic future to me.
Yeah, I guess I love that in the open source world, if you don't like model number one, you can actually dump it and train your own model, or choose another model. And in the sleeper context, any specific real-world example of sleeper agent behavior from a model, we'll see that model blacklisted by a huge fraction of the people who have choice. And the really scary world to live in is the one where ostensibly well-meaning people implemented Sam Altman's regulation a few years ago, and we actually only have 3 models that are dommed by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. And they make a high-level decision about how everyone's models are going to work from now on. And there are no alternatives because they're illegal, because well-meaning people decided that actually it was too dangerous to have open source AI systems.
Right, but this is where we're flipping between me in the position of saying there shall be no open source AI system, which is not what I'm saying.
I do wonder what governance policy you have in mind. I guess maybe it's too hard to say.
That's why I'm saying I don't know all the answers. Like, there's a whole liability bits to this question. There's whole duties of care bits to this question. There's whole collective action questions about where and when should you have an ability for a model not to be able to output something. Like, wherever you like, reasonable minds can disagree. I guess I'm reacting to what feels like this very stark characterization of like, total individual freedom gets you to the beautiful future, because I think we're playing with some very serious fire here, and there's very real risk.
I don't know that the open source community believes that. I guess the question for them is like, will open source even be relevant? Because it's so expensive and challenging to train these things. And so I actually don't know who you're critiquing or what particular position you're critiquing. My experience of the open source world is that it is constantly ambiguous whether it will have any life whatsoever, or whether it will ever have any substantive percentage of overall inference. And so please tell me, whose ideas, in what context. I genuinely don't know the people you're describing.
Okay. I mean, so this is actually the problem, Jenny, that you pointed out a second ago. Like, the problem with talking about AI is like, it seems like a topic, and then you realize it's not a topic, it's a hyperobject, and you're talking about every aspect of society at once. And so then, like, you're talking about kids, and then you're talking about warfare, and then you're talking about the economy, and then like everyone gets like dazzled by the sheer number of topics, and then you feel the agency just drain out of the room, and everyone goes, well, I guess someone smarter than me is going to figure it out. And like that last thing is the thing that I hate, because this time has to be the moment where we all build collective agency to choose the future instead of having the future just handed to us by Moloch, by the set of incentives that we're in. So that's not answering your question, but let me answer your question.
Sure.
Like,
And I'm going to have you answer the question, and then we're going to have to move on, although we could stay here all night, and I could stay here all night with you, but yeah.
Now I forgot the question. The question was like,
what is your governance suggestion, if not that
well, okay,
open source not be, allowed? Like, what practically speaking, what do you want to do?
Well, again, I'm not saying open source bad. I'm saying with open source comes new challenges. So take, for example, like China just released this interesting bit of law that's the ban against anthropomorphic AI. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, obviously, but that's what it's being labeled. So basic idea is having anthropomorphic AI that you don't know what's human and what's AI, that this is actually a problem, and people should be legally mandated to distinguish between what's AI and what's human. Largely speaking, I think that's a good thing. I think you would end up coming down on the side of that's a bad thing, because interfering with freedom of thought or freedom of expression vis-a-vis AI would be a mistake or somehow equal to authoritarianism. And that's where we really diverge, that in an open source world, there still has to be the ability for community norms, guidelines, laws. And I'm still going to push as hard as possible away from laws that end up looking like authoritarianism. But there's a whole spectrum here, and complete freedom to do whatever the hell I want is not actually what society looks like. There's a deep set of trade-offs about what are we permitted to do, what are we not permitted to do. And so take, for example, not permitting anthropomorphic AI or some other such banal law. How that plays in the open source community is really complicated in an age of AI. And that's much more complicated than an age of open source software of the late 20th century and early 21st century.
I think AI systems that act as though they're human are some of the most important versions of AI systems that can exist. Like the personal example I gave to you in the personal story, I created these clones of myself. They were pretending on some level that they represent my worldview and my emotions and my experiences. And I don't think that should be illegal.
So again,
Okay.
Yeah.
I hate to do it because I'm totally in it. And I thought it was you, and then I was just listening to Jeremy, but we're gonna.
Yeah.
But maybe we can do that for another
Yeah, I mean, just one quick kind of what's bubbling up to me is that I'm sort of seeing on one end of the spectrum huge concerns about centralization of power and design decisions because of the implications that they have for so many things, including the epistemic commons in terms of privacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So you have this like 1984 world direction. Maybe that's not the right one, but anyway, the centralization of power issue on one end of the spectrum, right? On the other end, and again, I'm trying to kind of articulate the risk landscape, because I think talking about risk is like pretty important in terms, like not just the upside here, right? So there's these really huge risks around centralization and misaligned AI, or centralization of power on one end, and OpenAI is mitigating those risks. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have these risks around empowering rogue actors to do things like cyber attacks, and so that hasn't come up. And also all of these unexpected consequences and externalities that we can't anticipate. Like, did we anticipate AI psychosis and all? So I feel like all of those unexpected externalities, potentially that risk is dialed up in open world. So I want to kind of, because I think it's very easy to kind of sit in one end of the risk landscape and have a very compelling argument. And I do think it is important to talk about this, like understanding the trade-offs with these really critical risks, because the risk landscape across AI is really important to understand and hold, at least try to keep the frame wide. So, all right. Okay, how are we doing? We're doing good.
Moving on. Yeah.
I put spaciousness in our agenda for a reason, and I have us moving on to phase 2 at 7:45 and at 7:42. Look at us.
Right.
Look at us.
Right on time.
Okay. Okay. So I want to invite Steph to just give us a little bit more perspective on this second part, because
Sure.
Steph also is the founder of Synthesis Media. She talks a lot about integration, and this is sort of taking us into unfamiliar territory that's going to move us towards synthesis. So can you tell us a little bit more about why the choice as the architect of the anti-debate, the steel manning and the red teaming, to help us see it from the other perspective?
Yes. So it's very, very simple. I mean, it's kind of what I said at the beginning. It's like, first we got to gather our different ingredients. We got some good ingredients to work with. Thank you. And then we explore how we might mix them together. And as part of that, the three parts of that, which we're about to do, are one, steel manning. Does anyone here not know what steel manning is? Okay, so steel manning is basically the opposite of straw manning. Straw manning is representing the weakest version of another perspective. So if I were to give an example from a really light topic compared to, let's just take abortion. I'm talking about AI. So that's something simpler. So if I were to straw man the pro-life perspective, I would say these are people who don't care about women's rights, who don't care about women's autonomy. If I were to steel man, if I were to really try to represent that perspective in good faith, I would say something like, these are people who recognize that life is sacred and that the moral calculus of abortion changes over the course of a pregnancy with increasing viability. So that's steel manning. It's really like, in good faith, representing the strongest version of the other perspective. And they will do this for each other to the other person's satisfaction. Like, do you ever do this in couples therapy where the therapist is like, can you repeat what they said so they understood? Wouldn't it be helpful in a debate if they they articulate what the other person said in a way that shows the other person that they fully understand what the other person is saying? So we're going to do that. Then the red teaming is kind of the inverse of that. So if steel manning is seeing the strength in the other person's position, red teaming is seeing the weakness in your own. And you can do that by asking a variety of questions, like we're going to ask, what would it take to change my position? But you could ask, what are the failure modes of my position? What are the unintended consequences of my position? What point of the other person's do I have no adequate rebuttal to? What point of mine is not falsifiable? So it's just ways of like poking holes in your own. And after you've kind of seen the strength in the other person and kind of seen where the holes are in yours, you're in a really good position to then explore how these different perspectives might be integrated. And we will guide you in that endeavor. So,
thanks, Steph.
Yeah.
I knew we would be remiss if I tried to do that versus you, so thank you.
All good.
Okay, so steel manning. We have 12 minutes. Daniel, you're up first. So first, you're going to ask a clarifying question to Jeremy so that you can accurately steel man.
Okay.
And then you've got 6 minutes.
Can you give me an example of the kind of clarifying question you're looking for?
Sorry. A question that will help you steel man. So anything that you're not understanding that would allow you to fully represent the strongest version of his position.
Got it. Oh, the problem is we've bounced around the map so much. I think I guess maybe the question I have for you is here. I'll start to steel man before the clarifying question, and then the clarifying question will make sense. So one, it seems very clear that you're worried about runaway centralization of power. If you think that the play field is structured such that like AI will just provide compounding returns, and then furthermore that the ring of power is so great that without transparency and without the ability to fight fire with fire, that the classical state games and propaganda games will run amok. And I guess my is that okay? And then I have a clarifying question for it. What did I get wrong?
Yeah, I guess, sorry, there's so many things I could say here. But practically speaking, I feel currently compelled to give OpenAI and Anthropic a tremendous amount of incredibly personal information. And I know they train on that, and I know they will clone products that they think are going to be profitable, and I know they can show up in legal cases because they can be subpoenaed, And so I feel like there's no encrypted private option, which I would 100% use if it had equivalent quality. So I feel like we already live in the centralized world in many important ways. And Pete Hegseth feels that way. He's like, we can't get rid of Claude, it's too good, right? Like there's a centralization of power in the natural dynamics of the industry that I think are leading to massive social conflict. Because if open source models were as good as Claude, who cares about Anthropic?
So I can come with you immediately and say, like, I wrote an article in Tech Policy Press about this, which I said, like, that, you know, the race to create a centralized dossier about who you are is so profound, and the lack of a fiduciary duty to use that in your interest, but rather they're compiling that to be used in other people's interests. I use the example of if you're a 22-year-old job seeker and you're saying, like, well, how do I impress in my first job interview? And the AI says, well, first you should think about the clothes you're wearing and what it says about you and your job qualifications. You know, like, is the AI trying to turn the conversation into a fashion conversation where it knows it can sell more ads? Is it doing, like, why is it doing that? And the lack of a fiduciary duty to holding your agency as primary is one of the core problems, like the principal agent problems here. And so yes, 100% with you there. I guess to get to the clarifying question is, like, when does your logic reverse? Like, when do you become sufficiently worried about the problems of chaotic actors undermining the fabric of our society, the ways that we actually tend to control people, that you actually say, you know what, I'm actually not just going to speak for individual agency?
Yeah, I guess that I unfortunately want to get, like, obnoxiously technical here.
Okay.
But basically, most important AI applications are a combination of many different LLM calls. And a chaotic actor can use a safe model, a model that's been maximized for its ability to reject, you know, drug use or terrorist use or bioterror use, whatever it might be, can use combinations of safe calls to achieve like incredibly chaotic aims reliably. So, I mean, this is almost a technological answer. I don't know that we currently have easy ways to stop bad actors from using even the most anodyne models in horrific ways. It's a genuine challenge.
Okay,
that we don't have a clean technical solution to.
I'll steel man that, but then I want to ask you the next question. So the steel man is, because you can work around any system relatively easily, that we shouldn't be even trying to prevent those excesses because it's possible to work around it. But where's the principle of good fences make good neighbors, right? Like the point of, it's possible to pick the lock on my house, but it doesn't mean that locks are a bad idea.
We just complete the steel man because we're going to ask Jeremy to sign off.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to steel man your perspective too. So to be clear,
did you finish, Daniel?
Sorry, I finished the steel man and then I twisted the knife at the end in a way that I probably shouldn't have.
But steel man with a little twist. Just give us like the final line of your steel man so that Jeremy can respond to it. We can ask Jeremy how you did.
Well, unfortunately, the steel man I can make doesn't pass my sniff test. So here's a steel man that I can make, which is, because it's possible for people to work around different technical ways of disallowing certain behavior, then we shouldn't try to, or we shouldn't prevent the, like, maybe I'm not doing sufficiently steel man.
So I guess that so when it comes to so to be clear, like when it comes to chaotic behavior, I'm thinking, you know, large scale cyber attacks, bioterrorism, like genuinely like bad actor kinds of actions. And it's, to be clear, it's not an argument that we shouldn't try our best to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. It's that the intervention that we use is actually pretty important. If the intervention we use is, let's disallow this subset of models and only allow that subset of models, then it's really important that that change actually improve our safety, actually make it less risky. And what is really important is that in the world where we get no actual safety gain, but we lose a lot, that's somewhat tragic. And secondly, I guess there's an important technical challenge. Well, how do you correlate action across multiple calls in a way that allows you to identify that it's a bad actor? And one answer might be, well, if there's a centralized source of the model, then it can try to do that autocorrelation. And Anthropic released this posts saying that Chinese models had basically cloned Claude by using it as a source of training data, and they found a number of accounts used by these Chinese companies that were correlated with one another. And you can do that if you're a centralized actor. So those are the kinds of solution to this problem of, between all of these AI calls in combination with one another, we've discovered there's a network of coordinated activity that it's relevant. And so I think there are solutions that involve mass centralization. So if everyone has to use the same model, then you can look at a person's pattern of behavior and identify that it's a cyber attack, or identify that they're trying to make a bioweapon, and you can find them and you can make them stop, or cut off their account, or whatever it might be. So I'm just pointing out that there are solutions that involve a lot of control, and I don't immediately think that it is worth the trade-offs, but those are the kinds of solutions that exist at present, technically speaking.
All right, that was your response.
Yeah.
Now it's your turn to Steelman. You have a question for Daniel, clarifying question that can support that?
Yeah, I guess that, as you said, it's all over the map, so where to begin? And maybe my first question for you is, what parts of your perspective on this do you feel are most unseen by me, or most misunderstood, so that I can try to resolve something of substance and make genuine progress here?
I appreciate the open-ended question. For example, even in the last answer to my question about when does your logic flip,
yeah.
I'm not sure I heard an answer to, I hear you pushing for the beautiful future and not wanting to undermine how quickly we can get to the beautiful future. But I'm not hearing you talk about the risk of eroding the very fabric of our society that allows us to quest to the beautiful future, and that supports us in, not only living the lives today, but supports us in science, in engineering, in art, in all of the things that we care about. And so the thing I don't feel like is being interacted with is, at what point do you become conservative, to use that term? If progressive is about how fast we can get to the better thing, and conservative is about how do we not lose the things that we care about, when does a conservative instinct kick in for you, or are you just pointing at the beautiful future?
Yeah, I guess there are a lot of theoretical worlds where I think I'd be very conservative, and so the challenge is many of the risks have just not come to be central risks. I see much more damage, for example, from the use of private models to, for example, do all your homework and on that basis learn nothing, or practically speaking, falsely represent yourself, or put content on social media. But to be clear, most of that's not open source. For the most part, that's being done with classic models.
I'm going to hit reset.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to hit reset.
Help me out here.
We were going to ask him a question, and then you asked him a question.
Oh, sorry. I think the question was meant to be a statement of.
He asked you a question of what do I not
Yeah,
understand?
I'm trying to figure out.
Saying so that I can probably.
I think the answer was this feeling that
When you
there's a
say erosion of
tenuousness.
society,
Right.
I actually don't know what you mean as well. So maybe my question
Maybe you
is,
could.
when you say
I was
erode
actually-
the fabric of society.
I was
actually
really
don't
wondering
know.
because we think about this and talk about this all the time with Denizen. So what are the mechanisms which you see that erosion happening?
Well, so.
And particularly
Right.
how might open source accelerate them?
Yeah, so the open source question is interesting. But first, let's talk about the mechanisms. One is if our collective decision-making systems, our democracies and our markets, I treat as both ways in which we try to point ourselves at a better future. We try to make allocation decisions. We try to make collective decisions about what we're doing. Those work because they have ratchets, right? Our system of science ratchets because it accepts more of what's true and rejects more of what's not true. Our political system has certain ratchets. I'm worried that if we don't understand what actually just happened, if we can't all agree on what's happening to us, it's impossible for us to choose a better future with any success. So you're going to undermine the very system of democracy, or rather, we're going to undermine the manner by which democracy ends up collectively pointing at more or less the right direction. And that's just one of many, right?
Okay, sorry. To be clear, the argument is that because of AI, we will not understand the market or the political scenario and on that basis won't be able to make better decisions about how to run our society. I'm trying to see where AI fits into this, like lost understanding of what's happening to us. And
Was this a degradation of the epistemic commons, which further accelerates democracy?
That's the more there's the epistemic commons is one. I mean, I was going to do a few different riffs, but yeah, epistemic commons is one. Second is, obviously our relationship to mental health, the way that we acculturate our children, the way that we do career development. Like there's a lot of things that we can, like right now we're pulling the career ladder up behind us at rapid pace. That may be the easiest one to talk about, right? Like entry-level jobs are going away massively. And the question about how do we train the next generation was always contained in, well, I need someone to do the grunt work. So let's hire
Jeremy,
them.
you're only going to have 3 minutes to
Right,
say
yeah.
anyway, so you don't need to know everything. But do you feel like you have enough of a...
Yeah, I mean, I can make a lot of arguments on these topics. These are great topics.
Right.
So let me maybe try to give a minute to the epistemic commons. The tragedy with AI is it's possible to effectively flood the social media networks with propaganda. And practice is already happening. It's really hard to go on Twitter and read responses and know with total confidence that it's not an AI-generated response. The AI botnets upvote one another. They have some agenda. They're selling something. They want to undermine something. They're political in some way. People, often smart people, interact with them as though they're real, and suddenly the discourse is skewed to whoever's controlling the AI botnet. And if you have an Anthropic or an OpenAI centralize the control of these AI calls, then maybe you can discover the person who's pulling the strings. But if there's high quality open source models, then actually who knows who's pulling the strings. And so the threat to the epistemic commons is that a huge fraction of our discourse is fake AI discourse, or is interactions with people who don't genuinely believe whatever it is they claim to believe.
That was good, by the way. That was a good steal, man.
Yeah. So I'm just coming up with things. To be clear, this is not. I know you didn't make this argument, but I would definitely make this argument. I guess on the question of mental health, there's a new category of psychosis, which is wild, which is people falling into loops. In some cases, relatively intelligent people talking to these AI systems, being told that they are brilliant, that their ideas are incredibly high quality when they're not, and people are falling in love with GPT-4o. There's this wild response when the model gets changed and its personality shifts. That makes me worry that, the people are not okay.
You still have a minute if you want to keep going, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Steel manning, Daniel.
I guess that on the question of the loss of entry-level jobs, there's a very raw sense that everyone's job is being thrown into question, almost no matter what you do. This conversation plausibly could be had with an AI system that would give you better responses than I would be able to create, right? Practically speaking. And when I was thinking about you debating me, asked what my clones would say about your arguments, and they said much more insightful things than I can come up with right now to tell you. And they searched through my entire worldview, and they really pulled up some phenomenal stuff. So what's going to happen to my job? Now, this is a much deeper question than the technology. It feels selfish on some level to say, oh well, I should have the job even though I can't do a better job than these super intelligent systems. And in a lot of ways, the economy is going to modify itself over and over and over again in the next few years. But practically speaking, open source AI means there's no off button. And the fine-tuning side of things means that if you want to clone me, not just try to do my job, but do my job as I would do it, it's easy.
Daniel, how did you do?
Pretty good. Just like I drifted. I think he drifted at the very end there into his slight knife twist. But I liked.
That's an open source thing.
But
I don't know how to make it an open source.
This is again the problem is we both kind of like open source, but where I disagree is not whether open source is useful in mixture. It's whether open source is going to bring us to the beautiful future, or whether it'll just end up in way more complexity. So I like where you ended on having no off button, and it feels like we're orbiting around the dangers of not having an off button and the dangers of having an off button. is kind of where we seem to be ping-ponging, right? The danger around someone that you don't know hitting the off button for bad reasons in order to obtain control versus, oh my God, this thing is running away and nobody can shut it down, and nobody can apply any controls. And I'm profoundly worried about that, given the pace of that, right? That we're in a complex
we don't know
future
what's
that
happen.
there's no control. Right.
There's no stopping it.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting somewhere. Is it working? Okay. All right, now we're going to move on to red teaming. And so you'll each answer the question, what would it take to change my position? The more specific, the better.
It's true, the more that position, because as you have both said, we've been all over the map. So what position are we talking about specifically? Maybe, should we use the on-off button that we just lit? That was a helpful kind of way to articulate where we've kind of landed. I guess, what would it take to change your position about how you would characterize, your relationship to this on-off button and who controls it?
Yeah, and the thing that is coming up for me around, like, if you look at the risk landscape, because I think the risk is the thing that I think will lend us towards one position or the versus the upside. The downside is the thing that's sort of scarier. I think part of what comes up to me is like, what is your perspective on what the probability distribution is across the potential risks? Right. So one of the things that you said, Jeremy, is I don't think we're actually mitigating the risk of bad actors using this technology, because we can't do it very well. So we're kind of getting all of the gains of mitigating the risk on this end of the spectrum versus the other. So Daniel might have different perspectives on whether that's true. Right. So that's one thing that's just on my mind when we're talking about, like, is there a sort of change of beliefs about what the risk landscape looks like that might influence your perspective. Okay, so we're going to do 4-ish minutes each. First, Jeremy. So 3 minutes answering the question, what would it take to change my position? And then Daniel, you'll have a minute to respond, and then we'll stop. What would it take to change your position?
Practically speaking, incredibly easy access, like open source gain of function research that leads to a tremendous number of COVID-esque tragedies actually happening would change my position. Practically speaking, I'm mostly going to detail like real world events that would change my position. So let's start with that. Second major thing that jumps to mind is the real use of a sleeper agent to accomplish something clearly nefarious. So, for example, an Iranian sleeper agent inside of some Chinese model that basically takes advantage of real world like military systems. So, the U.S. airplane turns on itself, destroying an American airbase because it was running on a model that was poisoned by this data source. It would be very interesting. Hard technically speaking to accomplish, but I think data poisoning, I don't know, it's perhaps a bit technical for this audience. If you want to not be recognizable by the facial surveillance system, you can put poisoned images of yourself and it'll mischaracterize you as other people. It's hard to do these things, but if they're successful, that's a very big deal. And then I think finally, I guess this is deeply red pill on open source, but I think the total publishing of a tremendous amount of private data. So basically the creation of these online profiles that connect people's images across the course of their life, that go across every social media network, like there being a public, a Facebook you can go to that shows you the totality of every person's full online behavior for all time. That would be a very important thing to turn off, I think.
Okay. Response, a minute, and then we'll stop.
Those are good. I think. I think instead of like the warplane example, I would say take Kimi K2 or whatever gets integrated with a bunch of businesses, and then all of a sudden you find out that $1 billion in aggregate got wired to some foreign account. Like there's plenty of more banal ways than like the action movie way of the warplane turning that could be quite disastrous if the sleeper agent works. But yes, I'm with you that were we to see such behavior that would prove that, then you'd say, okay, you don't believe that it's likely that you have this sort of sleeper agent in the closed source.
One moment of dialogue. So I actually think we deal with risks as a society all the time. People don't sign up for the dangerous OpenClaw service. I didn't, because it was not sufficiently safe. So I think a lot of these cases, if this happens, immediately society will change in a big, big way.
Oh, so you don't like building codes? You're not a big fan of building codes?
We're not going to get into
No.
I don't want to go deep into. I mean,
Okay, well,
I'll finish. I'll let you finish what you're saying. Yeah,
Well,
I just don't want to go back and forth.
Well,
'cause
I'm sorry, I feel bad cutting
Okay,
into
okay.
your response as well. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Well, okay, we can flag it for later. But I'm curious because there are parts of society that I agree with you. It's like if you want to do the dangerous thing, if you want to go bungee jumping, fine, go do that. And then there's parts where we say it's contagious enough where like you installing your electrical system wrong catches my house on fire, so everyone's house has to be wired up in the same way, and there's a contagion aspect that I feel like you're not contending with that we can go into later.
In which context?
We're gonna keep.
Okay, let's keep rolling. Yeah.
Sure.
See, I mean, again, the landscape is so vast and such.
Yeah, sorry,
It's so flippin' interesting that I would love to dive into it. But okay, so now it's your turn to red team. Daniel, 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one thing that you mentioned is the risk of stagnation. I guess if I believed the risk of stagnation as opposed to delaying by 2 or 3 years were more real, if I actually thought we could enter some century-long dark age, as opposed to like a 5 or 10 year delay to some of the great gains, then I think my position would flip. I don't see the mechanism for a century of dark ages and not continuing
Happens all the time.
this research. Okay, yeah, right.
Nuclear power is a great example. Very common, actually.
Sure, but okay, but were I to believe that we'd enter some, or like psychedelic research or something, I don't know, were I to believe that you'd enter some ban that would last for 80 years and then you'd go, oh my God, what the hell happened? Then I would flip. If I believe, so I think one of the things I do believe is that the technology inverts the logic of control. Like when markets were introduced, it changed what the state could do because the state is now beholden to the markets in a way that they thought that they could control the markets, but they can't. Turns out the markets control the state oftentimes. If I thought that we could the state could much more easily control this, on one hand, then I would reverse it and I'd be much more open source because it becomes more of a normal technology. I don't think that it is. Or on the other hand, if I really thought it was completely inevitable that, I'm blowing on a forest fire, then I would probably reverse, although we'd enter some other conversation of like grabbing the family albums and running, right? Like there'd be some other affect, but I would probably reverse then too. I don't know, that's probably enough for now. Sure.
Great. Any reflections? You've got a minute.
Yeah, explain the forest fire. Like, in what world does that happen?
Oh, I mean, I hear a lot of arguments. This may not be you, but I hear a lot of arguments about just the inevitability of the AI transformation.
Yeah.
That, and this is where like there's some analogy in my head. You sort of sound like some of like Balaji and some of the crypto community, where to make a bad analogy, it's like it's going to be too dangerous for you to know who I really am. So everyone's going to have set up shell companies that are on private wallet addresses. And there's this sort of analogy between that and the AI thing of like, oh, my AI is going to be defending against your AI. And both of these things feel tantamount to a destruction of a lot of the social fabric that we care about. If I really thought that was completely inevitable and that I was just purely foolish for trying to preserve some of the things that I care about early 21st century society through the AI transformation, then I'd probably end up in a different, more accelerationist posture. But I do think that it's possible to preserve a lot of what we care about even as we transform our world into an AI-empowered one.
I see. Yeah, I guess I definitely am not an inevitabilist, so I don't like those arguments, actually. Okay. But when it comes to stagnation, I'm part of the author of Thiel on Progress and Stagnation, which is a 100-pager on the stagnation hypothesis. And AI is, in my opinion, like more or less the light in the darkness. In its absence, there actually would be very little happening and very little reason to hope that you or I would survive. And this is not a small deal. It's actually very important. So when you look at
I
40
agree with
years
that
of
for what it's
stagnation
worth.
in the world of atoms. It's actually tragic that on almost every important real-world physical technological axis, from planes to space flight, pre-Musk certainly, but we haven't been back to the moon, practically speaking, to certainly psychedelic research, but generally speaking, the idea that chemistry could be a path forward for humanity. Like, there are so many axes on which progress has totally stagnated, and AI gives us, for the first time, hope in that world.
I agree.
So,
I agree with you, and I just want to come to your side. I agree that is the ambient context that we're in. My fear.
Sorry. One more thing. It's
Wait,
also
okay.
easy to imagine the environmentalist movement, but for artificial intelligence, where there's some civilization totalizing ethical perspective that the right thing to do is stop AI progress, and if you're not working on that, you're not a good person.
So,
and it's really easy for me to imagine living in that world because I lived in that world for many years.
So great. I really want to touch on this.
Yeah.
Take nuclear. The story of nuclear, in my mind, is we were too hasty at the beginning of nuclear power, and we had a few major accidents that caused that exact reaction, and then therefore the stagnation and the rejection of that technology for way too long. And if we were much more careful for the first 5 or 10 years of nuclear power development, we would have seen nuclear power much faster, powering our cities much more safely. And so that thing that you don't like, that stagnation, was in part caused by the absolutely rash and absolutely careless deployment of nuclear technology in the 50s and 60s, I guess. But
there were a few meltdown events, but it's unclear to me that they were rash. I would love more technical details on exactly how careless they were being. And I think a lot of the disproportionate response is actually nuclear fear. It is more to do with nuclear weapons than with the seawater location of this Japanese power plant. And that people actually have prevailing biases about nuclear bombs that they transfer to nuclear power, and people have prevailing biases about artificial intelligence that they transfer to Waymo.
That was true about a Gen 3 plant like Fukushima, but it was not true about Chernobyl. Chernobyl was almost an absolutely species-transforming event.
Yeah, on some level, maybe this is irresponsible. I feel like Chernobyl is the Russians. I don't know.
We're going to talk about nuclear. You're getting everything for the price of one.
Sorry. Just to be clear, the point is that stagnation in AI is a very real possibility from a cultural perspective, and I expect that there will be a lot of people who really want that to happen, who want to kill AI. They're everywhere, actually, and it's because they're likely being replaced. The AI artist war happened, about 2 years ago. It was wild. So it's not a theoretical argument. Actually, people have very strong feelings about this.
I just want to close the loop for a second, which is I'm with you about the ambient stagnation. My fear is that even though AI is a bright light, it doesn't follow that you should just take that bright light and light everything on fire as fast as possible. Yes, it is a bright light in a world of stagnation, but how we should shepherd that light into transforming our society doesn't mean that that's just let's just blow on the fire as much as we can. We should tend to it carefully.
I guess I disagree, actually. I know it sounds like how dare you for something so reasonable, but I think a lot of why open source AI matters is that it makes it impossible. It's a game theoretic argument, to be clear. It makes it impossible for these centralized actors to vary in an aggressive way from what everyone wants to happen.
So I'm going to thank you for bringing us back to open source. No, thank you, and I'm also going to bring the audience behind the curtain a little bit. So in designing the anti-debate and thinking about it, one thing I want to do, but I didn't do in this case, and it's a question for me, and I'll be very curious to hear what you think at the end, is, so it kind of drives me insane the way that debates are often framed as a yes or no question, as if the answer, should we speed up on AI or slow down? As if the answer is speed up or slow down. And so my natural inclination, my desire, is to frame the question in a way that's more like, under what circumstances? So this is a question that we could ask. Under what circumstances can open source AI mitigate? Under which circumstances? Under some circumstances it will, and under other circumstances it won't. But for purposes of starting with tension, if you remember, we started with more of a I mean, we could have said can, but that would have driven me a little bit insane, because then it would have been really a yes or no question. Can it? Yes or no? So we started with, to what extent can it? And we've kind of been positioning them on, to a greater extent, Jeremy, to a lesser extent, Daniel. But this will be a question that I will be curious to ask you all at the end, or for you to be thinking about, is like, should it just be framed up front in this kind of a way, and just really spend the entire time kind of like drawing the lines around the circumstances? So anyway, just bringing you behind the curtain for a sec, but we're gonna now shift into really kind of exploring how we might integrate. So now I guess, keeping this question in mind, we're not saying can open source, yes or no. We're saying under what circumstances can it, and where and how do we draw the line? And I'll just pose a couple questions that might help you kind of like find each other here. And what would be amazing is if we can come away with some kind of answer to this question, really, is some kind of framework for thinking about, like, obviously we're not going to come out being pro-open source or anti-open source, but some sense of like, okay, I now have an understanding of the circumstances in which I would pursue open source, I would use open source because of X, Y, and Z, and maybe I also have an understanding of like, how might I change the incentive, assuming that we would like to be using open source more often, and that is a total assumption, but let's just say that, let's just make that assumption for a sec. How would I have to change the incentive landscape so that I could use it more often? Because all of these risks that we've been talking about would be more easily avoided. So I'm just gonna leave these questions up here and let you kind of just openly find your way, maybe, to some kind of framework. And these three questions these are the questions that I use when I'm trying to integrate different perspectives. Very simply, is there an either or that can be flipped to a both and? Right, so obviously it's not either or open source, but using it in these circumstances and perhaps not these. Is there a yes or no? I mean, that's very similar in this case. Yes or no to under what circumstances, if any? And then, are there perverse incentives that are making this issue harder for us to resolve, or that are kind of pitting us against each other when we could actually just be, right, holding different parts of a bigger framework?
Can I start with the last one, actually?
Go for it.
So the place of most proximate agreement between us, I think, is, correct me if I'm wrong, is human agency is, I think, our most precious resource. And our software, our technology should be helping blow on the flames of my agency. Like, I'm of an age now, I think I'm a little older than you. I walk into a room and I forget why the hell I walked into that room. Like, I want software that helps me accomplish, become who I want to become, do what I want to do, make real of my life and of the world what I want. And it should be nurturing that agency. Now, the great mistake we've made over the last 20, 30 years in software was we conflated what I want to do and what I can't help but do, right? And that's the whole social media story, is sort of that conflation and a bunch of other problems there. Right. I think we both want software that is a fiduciary for our agency as individuals in the world. And to the extent that we're on different sides about open source, I think it might be the perverse incentives around the software stack that has you sort of saying, if not for open source, we cannot fix that incentive structure. And I think if I agree with that, then I come to where you are pretty quickly. And I believe there's a huge place for open source in this. So again, I'm not anti-open source as a person, but I actually think we need to fix that misaligned incentive more generally, whether it's closed or open source.
Yeah, I love this frame that software should enhance agency. And I guess I'm the author of a paper around recommender systems that are aligned with human interests. So I'm interested actually in the recommender that says, here's what's maximizing your conception of time well spent. Here's the video, you'll say, oh my God, I'm so happy that I watched this video, as opposed to instinctual optimization. So deeply agreed. I feel in part like I'm coming to this conversation from like a little bit in the future and want everyone to feel what that feels like. And in that world, you would all feel like open source AI was clearly an extension of yourself. And so rather than it being the AI doing things to you, it actually is, much more like, oh, I wrote this, great piece on this idea. Let me share it with you, where your like capabilities are enhanced. Oh, here's what here's what I think about this idea. So where everyone has like by default a like on your phone, on your computer, totally private, totally encrypted body of AI systems that do like exactly what you would do and think in many ways the things that you would think, and that clearly operate as extensions of your personal agency, so that when you're making an important decision, they actually know your total history and they think through the decision in depth and detail, and they like talk to you about what you actually will experience, and they accurately predict how to improve your life, and they help. And so there's a world where you trust these local AI systems that are trained on a ton of private data, like way more private data than you would give to your family even, but that are local. And so this is the open source stream. The open source stream. I live in this future.
Permit me to make this a little spicy for a second.
Fair enough.
In your setup to this
Yeah.
is the perfect way of making your position superior, because assume that I too come from the future. And I too am saying, hey, there's things that are happening that your rhetoric in today is not letting in. I come from the future and I've seen side effects that you aren't seeing. Right? And so it feels like implicitly you're saying, oh, there's something about my Daniel's language that detects that I'm not understanding, or that lets you detect that I'm not understanding the capability of self-authorship and flourishing of becoming the person I want to become.
You're just not talking to open source clones of yourself every day.
Most people aren't.
Most people aren't.
Okay.
And so to be clear, like you would
Right,
respect
but
freedom of thought. So when I say, oh, like speech needs to apply to these models, it's because a huge fraction of my thoughts are processed in tandem with fine tunes of open source models.
Okay. I mean, I haven't taken on that project to the degree that you have.
That's all I have to say. It was a very
Okay.
way to point to the fact that this can easily be reality for you and for everybody in a private and local way.
But let's
it
assume,
isn't because of technical limitations.
But let's assume I actually understand
Yeah.
that project and how useful and interesting that project will be. And I'm not saying something as silly as I think you think I'm saying, which is I'm not saying AI is just happening to me. I believe that we can author our own AI futures, and I feel like that will be more dystopian in part than your language is allowing, and more utopian in part than some other people's language is allowing, right? Like it's just going to be way more complex, and we don't have the language to discuss all the transformation that this is going to do to us.
So we're gonna try to answer this question. We're gonna try, and maybe we should give you some specifics. Actually, that's what I'm gonna find a specific scenario to give you. But what we're trying to do is we've heard a lot about we've heard about the benefits of open source AI and heard about the risks, and we want to get a sense of the circumstances in which to use it and not to use it, and to change the incentive landscape, so which would change the circumstances in which we would use it and not use it.
So I guess one circumstance that I love is the one where it's both cheap and easy and technically feasible for it to be your AI. Like, why do I need to trust Sam Altman's AI? Why do I need to trust the AI that, practically speaking, is trying to advertise to me, is setting me up to purchase something that I don't want to purchase? I want to live in this world where, by default, customized personal models are both everywhere, but also are in this concept of like fiduciary interest to one's own agency, are deeply trained to be for me. I feel like we live, so everyone probably has personal phones and personal computers. I feel like we live in an era where all AI systems are still like massive computer mainframes inside of huge companies. And we don't have personal computers as yet. And so the circumstance which makes these models really serve our personal agency is the one where everyone gets a personal AI or body of AIs that they teach to serve them very well and that they trust because it actually is totally controlled by them, totally private to them, and where, in many ways it's an intimate relationship that's as deep as they have with, personal friends.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that quite off the bat.
I'm gonna why don't we, it feels obvious to actually just talk about the Anthropic DOW situation that has just happened. So the scenario that I'm gonna give you is that, so I'm just gonna read this out loud. So Anthropic held red lines precisely because it's a closed lab. Wait, does anyone here not familiar with what happened over the last couple weeks between Anthropic and the Department of War? Okay. I mean, I could summarize it, but
You want me to summarize it? I'll summarize it very quickly. So Anthropic is one of the single of the frontier AI developers that is being used in classified activities in the Department of War. They've had a contract with them since the Biden administration. It was expanded in the Trump administration. There's always been a component of the contract that says you cannot use our models for domestic mass surveillance and you can't use them for fully autonomous weapons. Lethal autonomous weapons. And the Department of War basically decided that they weren't okay with those terms. Potentially more on principle than not, or potentially because they wanted to do those things. And so there was a huge standoff between the two of them. Anthropic held the line. The Department of War labeled them a supply chain risk. It's never been designated for a US company. It has, and now Anthropic is suing the DOW. And so it kicked off this, it's really this sort of standoff between the Trump administration that wants to do things and its own agency around policy and like what are the rights of a private company in determining how its product will be deployed. And some of the punitive things that the Trump administration is doing in response are arguably degrading private property and speech and democratic values. Is that an okay synthesis of that for everybody?
Thank
okay.
You. Yes. Okay, so here's the question for you guys. So Anthropic held red lines precisely because it's a closed lab that controls deployment. If Claude were open source, the DOW dispute would be moot. The government could simply fine-tune and deploy the weights however it wanted with no contractual leverage for Anthropic at all. So, does open source eliminate the problem of corporate restraint on government, or does it just shift the risk somewhere worse? And I'm gonna add another. I'm just gonna throw another and just let you find it. So you are also pointing at this frame that I think many of us here in the room hold of the kind of the twin gutters or the two attractors that we want to avoid. One of them being oppression, and let's just use China as an example, and chaos, like decentralized catastrophe weapons for everybody. And we want to avoid both of those. And so how do we chart this narrow path? And I think kind of like the real core question that we're trying to get at here is to what extent, what is open source's role in avoiding both of those gutters? How do we understand what its role is in this endeavor of trying to chart this narrow path?
Well, I guess I would say there's another question of how do we prevent some of the things that we don't want to see in the world. So, I think it was 2017 or 2018, the Future of Life Institute put out a now prescient video called Slaughterbots. I don't know how many of you have seen this. So Slaughterbots at the time seemed pretty science fiction-y, and it laid out a world where, you have these little micro drones that have bullets in them and swarms of them that, basically could take a peaceful protest and kill everyone in the peaceful protest, and nobody knows who released them, et cetera, et cetera. Things that actually from 2026 look like they're happening, right? They look like they're happening in Ukraine, they look like they're happening in other places, and you fast forward 2 or 3 years, autonomous drones as not just weapons of war, but as like extraordinary CIA-style actions that are covertly assassinating people seems like a future we're barreling into. Now, again, with the open source question, it's like, the question I think that has to be answered is, can we collectively act to prevent that world from becoming the world that we live in? Is there a credible path to us collectively saying, no, like we are not going to build that world? Or are the incentives so powerful that we're just going to end up there, right? And I believe that we can collectively come and say no, and then that demands some degree of restraint on what we deploy, what we allow, people to use. Now, that to your point about the two gutters, some degree of restraint shouldn't be seen as a slippery slope all the way to authoritarianism. But restraint is part of every culture, every wisdom tradition, every legal system. And so the question about what does restraint look like in an open source AI world, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that answer is not let it rip, right?
So actually, China was open to some resolutions around autonomous weapons, and the United States actually declined and wanted to move forward with creating high-quality autonomous weapons. So, practically speaking, there is a question about whether the U.S. government, whether Pete Hegseth, who instigated this conflict with Anthropic, in my opinion, primarily theatrically. That is, I think Anthropic was persona non grata about 6 months ago in the Trump administration, and there was a practical question about how to transition to a distinct provider, which is being resolved by this public conflict. And the fact that they accepted a superficially similar agreement from OpenAI immediately says something about that. Now, the US government chose not to attempt to stop the creation of slaughter bots, but instead accelerate military programs that would guarantee that the US military was as capable as possible.
It has the best slaughter bots, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Sorry, where were you going with that? I wasn't trying to get you to shut you down.
Well, and so, practically speaking, I see the question of centralization as in part a question of soft nationalization. That is, Anthropic and OpenAI are in the United States, and practically speaking, their CEOs can be lambasted and possibly arrested by American officials. And practically speaking, all of them, at least in public, give extreme deference to the military bend the knee, so to speak. And even in the opposition, Dario says, it's not that I'm against building slaughter bots. It's not what he says. He says, the slaughter bots aren't good enough yet.
The model's not there yet.
I think it's an easier thing to say in public, but yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was our end.
Everybody. Don't forget to breathe. How are we on time?
We're running over
Okay.
the half an hour extra I gave us. So
Sorry, I'm having tremendous self-doubt right now that we're just on some random walk through all of these topics. So apologies if we're ping-ponging around. It's we're now in the war topic.
But that is the reality.
Right.
AI is not something narrow, even trying to talk about it in the context of open source.
Every time you do this.
It bleeds out into... It's pervasive. It's this tidal wave. You think that social media had implications for society, AI is the next orders of magnitude more profound implications. And so it's not really possible to have a conversation without.
This is my daily
I try
experience.
to have some sort of a landscape, at least about the risk, to make sense of it.
Right.
But
You two also just have different perspectives that are much bigger and upstream of just a open source. So
Yeah.
I think it's probably challenging to narrow yourselves into this little topic when there's so much going on upstream of that.
well, hopefully,
Influences
yeah.
What
I hope.
you think about
I mean,
open source.
I think the problem is quite deep, because you can use AI for almost every real world application in almost every major position of employment. And it is possible to go, job by job and debate open source AI in the context of that economic role. And it's
that's
possible,
just the economic
application by
restructuring
application.
piece of it, yeah.
You can go law, you can go medical, you can go military, and in every context there will be some consequence to open source AI. And practically speaking, it's actually kind of challenging to ask someone to have a coherent philosophical position about open source AI across all of those distinct applications, because it's plausible that actually they don't have a position on whether AI should be open or not. They have context by context positions on whether openness is good in that context. And they're performing some sum or some aggregation intuitively and coming to an
Yes.
overall perspective. That doesn't mean everything's positive or negative.
That's well said.
And
Hence the question, under what circumstances, and if I mean, just to play this out for everybody here, if we had started with this question, I could have like made a matrix or something and listed, 10 different circumstances and had us actually go through each of them and then try to kind of extract some higher level principle that we're using to decide, what criteria are we using to decide in which circumstances to do what. So I guess that might be a vote for me to actually start with a question like this. But I think we're going to move us into phase
Just the last
3.
phase. And I think if we can move
And
through
then we're
it
going
fairly
to open it
quickly.
up. Don't worry, you will have a chance to respond. So go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, so this next section will be about 15 minutes. So why don't we target kind of wrapping around 9 so that people who want to get home can get home and
Well, we can
go to sleep, and then we can keep talking. We can
just-
break into some of the questions and if people want to.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we can just literally just do each of you
Yeah, I think
closing
this-
statements.
Do you want to move into that?
How your view was expanded, if at all, and then we'll
Sure.
hand it over to the audience.
Okay, closing statements. Let's start with you, Daniel.
Okay. So I guess my experience of doing this is just surprise at trying to figure out where we're agreeing and disagreeing. I guess the thing that comes up for me right now is, we're in a constant dance between the power of the individual, the power of the state, and the power of corporations. And there may be like another set of actors, but like any one of those actors winning, in my mind, produces a different kind of dystopia, right? The individual's winning produces Mad Max, the state's winning produces 1984, the corporate's winning produces Amusing Ourselves to Death. And so we have to have this fluid dynamic tension and prevent any one of them from being the king of the hill. And we need to have some way of, again, this notion of agency of like, how do we collectively want to build the future, not just each of us individually and not just states and not just corporates. I don't have an answer to those questions, but it feels like we've been orbiting these tensions, and then we've each been somewhat confused, judging by the look on your face. I've certainly been somewhat confused about where we're even disagreeing in that dance.
Yeah, we can have an interactive closing statement, but if that's what you used to say, that's great. Yeah, I guess my experience of this debate has been, pretty, I want to say, sort of challenging. This is the word that jumps to mind. Basically, it's hard to cover all of these subjects in a current way. There are many positions that feel contradictory at first glance, but are also sort of deeply technical, and if you look into the details, like perhaps something that is sort of surprising makes sense. I think it's very hard to come up with governance solutions that are at all functional. And I think core to a lot of my perspectives are actually a body of underlying assumptions about how for every policy position you might come up with, actually the practical consequences of that policy are probably not what either of us would want them to be. And the actors at hand, so as soon as you get into the details of a question like, whose government is the one that wants the slaughter bots, and like whose government is the one that will be in control of the AI system if we build it, the situation becomes very empirical and very practical, and it becomes clear, actually, practically speaking, open source is not state of the art, so it doesn't matter. And if it did matter, it is unclear that how much, if at all, it would affect the scenario. I guess I come away with a few of the Steelman positions seeming very interesting to me, so I guess I appreciate you guys on that basis. I think that there are a lot of specific scenarios in which I would be deeply uncomfortable with the Mad Max scenario, and it's because we happen to not live in that world. And it's because of lots of predictions that we would live in that world that have not come true, that I've this body of experiences that make me intuit that we're going to continue to not see a lot of these prospective risks dominate. And empirically speaking, like there haven't been sleeper agents that matter. Empirically speaking, there haven't been substantive, like open source specific risks. Like you can use the non-open source models to do a huge number of these sort of cyber attacks. And actually, those are the ones that dominate cyber attacks, or the closed source models at present. And that's a quality distinction primarily. So it just feels like there are not actually empirical grounds to challenge open source. And so a lot of that is kind of informing my implicit arguments that these things are a net good. But yeah, I guess I'm kind of sad in practice. I think that a lot of the promise of open source has just not come true. I think in practice we live in a context where there's mass homogenization of AI thought, and where if you have people who are using AI systems all the time, they end up with surprisingly similar positions on things, and practically speaking, all the AIs give the same kind of response to the same kind of question. And I worry that if we integrate with these in a deep way, and a huge fraction of our societal thinking is done in concert with these AIs that are all thinking more or less the same things, that there will be a lot of damage, both to people's ability to think, in the sense, if you have a tool that replaces it, like if you have Google Maps, you just stop thinking about how the world physically looks and works, and you lose the ability to navigate. And simultaneously, everyone is being cordoned into the same subset of ways of thinking about things. And as someone who devotes his life to intellectual diversity, to creativity, who puts creative invention at the beating heart of society, that is a tragedy. And I see open source as potentially resolving that tragedy, but practically speaking, it just hasn't done that. And so I just see it as a failure for the most part. It's not kept up with state of the art for the most part. And customization, which has been happening all over the place with image models. And actually, we haven't talked really much about the visual world, or the ability to create custom.
I'm not sure you can open any new topics. At this
I
point.
don't know if this is the time. The closing statement. But that actually just hasn't happened in the world of language models, which is where most thought and most decision making and most important activity resides, in my opinion. I guess I kind of think the world we live in at present is a little tragic and slightly dystopic because of its centralization. And so we already live in the centralized world. That's the only reason the Anthropic Pete Hegseth conversation even makes sense, is that we're already in this hyper-centralized scenario. And currently I see open source as a potential off-ramp for that scenario that's probably not going to happen. And so, it's about preserving a source of hope as opposed to ending up in this sort of buoyant future by default. I guess maybe the final closing thought is something along the lines of the anti-debate as a context. So I've really enjoyed the growthful intention here that seems implicit in the anti-debate. Most debates are about conclusions. This debate is about transformation. And so I just wanted to sort of commend the creators of the anti-debate and perhaps get a rousing round of applause for their invention. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I'll just, so maybe just to say one little note on that before opening it to all of you. The goal of the anti-debate is not to change minds, but to expand minds. Right? We're not looking to convert you to me or me to you, but to give all of us a more comprehensive view. Hence the tagline of the anti-debate, a debate that everyone can win. So thank you all. Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for Jeremy, Dan, Jenny. And let's open it up to all of you. Questions about, obviously we could go anywhere, abortion, nuclear, any topic you want, they got that. Or about anything that and suggestions. Anything, yes. And should I pass the mic around?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh.
Can I just take one of yours? This was fascinating in many different ways, and I really appreciate the format too. Just wanted to say that. And to give you more context, I am Bogdana, and I'm working on this kind of from the lens of law as part of an AI team in a law firm. And I love that, Daniel, you mentioned legal systems at some point. That was great. I mean, yeah, speaking of sort of accountability, responsibility, and all of that, and institutions declining. So my question is really kind of leading into that institution decline. Part of the argument that I was curious about your thoughts on, and sort of many current AI governance mechanisms, right, like legal regimes, liability frameworks, and so on, right, are quite limited in the pace of AI systems. So I guess I'm curious about how do you think about, I don't know, this institutional reimagination, and like what are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about all the different ways that AI can be used to find win-win solutions to problems that have seemed very zero-sum, right? So take as a distinction, like, I always think that like homeowners associations are a great fertile ground to play. Like everyone hates them, but it turns out that if you had like a high-touch team of like, 20 business school grads to go around and they could figure out some pretty amazing things. And that's kind of what AI is like AI can do that groundwork and figure out all the different places of unlikely agreement. You're seeing this, at a national scale in Taiwan, like Audrey Tang's work of finding places of unlikely consensus, reflecting that back to the population. I think there's a huge amount of headroom there, and I'm very excited about it. Now, on the flip side, the things that I'm not excited about are the places that are intrinsically zero-sum. So take legal discovery. Like when legal discovery is capped out at the amount of pain that each legal team can endure, right? And when you can actually you can read all the documents and each side can just arms race each other. Those are the parts of these sort of truly zero-sum arms races are going to get very strange when they're AI empowered. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, we're certainly at one of these institutional degradation and reimagining moments. What does it look like to have a truly empowered and empowering set of like AI governance that helps grease the gears between our misunderstandings, between our failures of imagination? Like super excited about that.
I just sort of, what was coming up for me weirdly was, I feel like in 10 years, we're gonna be really happy that Donald Trump was president. And the reason is because I think, before he became president for a second time, I don't think we could imagine our government murdering peaceful protesters. I don't think that we could imagine all these very authoritarian things that our government is doing. And at the same time, AI is coming so powerful, the way we look at AI, because we're experiencing Donald Trump's government, I think is really different than if we were, let's say, still under a more boring, predictable government. And I just think we now can imagine how scary it can be when we do have robot drones shooting at us, and can imagine that our government would do that when I think previously we might not have been able to imagine the slaughter bots.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a question there, but yeah, practically speaking, I think it's helpful to continually imagine your government as having its own objectives as opposed to earnestly representing whatever it is that you genuinely want. And yeah, the mass surveillance question is a really important technological question. It's now possible for the totality of whatever private information exists about you to be used as leverage against you in a way that, without search agents, without, coding agents would be very, very challenging.
And furthermore, the data trail that everyone sort of assumed was going into the void to now be...
It's now all usable.
Now all usable.
Yeah. And yeah, actually, the reality about agents is you don't need profiles, actually. You can create profiles in real time on the fly. And you can do reverse image search at scale, and you can do automated disambiguation of certain people. So certainly all you need is the data. You don't even need the profiles to be put together. Actually, an agent can just use it. So yeah, the question is, who has all of that information about you, and what are they using it for, and are they using it against you? And there's a lot of ways in which it was actually time-consuming and effortful and challenging to use it against you in the past. But agentic systems can plausibly use it against you at scale. in a way that was not possible before. So okay, what can be done with the information? Well, now it's straightforward to reveal information in a scalable way.
And by the way, this is
in a selective way.
This is true of governments, but it's also true of individuals, right? So it's also true, you have all these isolated pieces of information about you in different places, then it becomes very trivial to merge, and it becomes like a binary explosive of your data, right? Like each thing is inert on its own, but you mix them together and you have the perfect way to hack into your life, understand your psychological weaknesses. It's exploitable by governments, exploitable by corporations, it's exploitable by rogue individuals. And so the true answer is like, we're suddenly in this offense dominant world where there's all these new ways to be taken advantage of or undermined that we don't even have a language to understand what the vectors of attack are, let alone the defenses against. So it's like wild times, like, buckle up.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a different question. I'm curious, I know, Jeremy, you had spoken for a moment about people having like incredible amounts of longevity and not experiencing disease. And I thought that was fascinating because there's no part of me that like wants to live forever, or do you know what I mean? So I was fascinated to hear a little more about it, because to me death is what gives life meaning. And so and I think there's a lot of value in disease, and so I'm just so curious about your perspective on this, because it's blowing my mind. Like, I haven't heard anyone in my circle say something like that.
Have you ever wanted to feel, look, and be younger?
Yes, but not enough to like completely augment my reality. It's like I want a lot of things, right? I want to fly. I want to be able to bilocate to two places at once. And there's a lot of things I want, but do I think by me having them, that's going to make my life better or make me a better person? Probably not.
So there's a whole bunch of, this is a deep rabbit hole. There's a whole bunch of interesting philosophy around this. Like, you can look
maybe I'd sort of a spiritual level then.
You can look at, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I think the right spiritual perspective of this is that of the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity and Judaism, there is a spiritualization of death after which you go to heaven. Practically speaking, a huge amount of our culture's perspective on death is, on some level enriched by this concept that in the face of death, you become one with God. This is actually something that it shouldn't be, a thing you fear. Your loved ones and relatives, because they were faithful, are taken care of. And practically speaking, like, my family's conception of death was actually you're a good person in life, otherwise you will end up in hell. Because you believe in Jesus Christ, you end up in heaven. And so on that basis, it doesn't make sense to be afraid of death. Death is a good thing at the end of the day. And I think that the materialist perspective on the Christian afterlife and its story is actually a pretty brutal one. But I think for a lot of people who deconverted in the face of scientific evidence, they still held on to conceptions of the Christian apocalypse. And it's still very central to how they conceive of artificial intelligence. And so I think a lot of these questions are now being renegotiated. How should we relate to death spiritually? And there are a lot of answers that we can have. Answers of acceptance. I think the Buddhist frame typically is centered around the acceptance, the emotion, experience of equanimity in the face of arbitrary psychological or emotional pain. But I think that very closely tied to our inability to allow people to live longer is our acceptance of it. And if it was clear that it was possible to live in a young way forever, that people would see that as like human right very quickly. And the reason they would be angry that the other people would be younger than them, perhaps, right? They would actually create a movement around it being essential that there be equal representation of people who have access to the technology that allows you to stay young. And so there's just a very technical bottleneck
How
here.
does this
Is
relate
that-
to your homogeneity question, where everything's homogenous, so everyone's young, everyone lives forever? It sounds so boring to me.
We could keep going.
Okay.
I just want to give. Dan, did you want to make a couple?
I was saying, if you're interested in this, if you're interested in the philosophy of this, there's Nick Bostrom's, I think it's called The Parable of the Dragon, where he writes a whole essay on this. I think there has to be some healthy middle ground between the nihilism that comes from those past traditions that you're talking about and the sort of Brian Johnston, so on one hand you've got sort of pure egoism and no care about lineage and sort of the extension of the boomers, lack of succession planning and lack of seeing ourselves as part of a lineage on one hand, and then this pure nihilism and denial of death is a problem on the other, and there must be a wiser middle ground than has been articulated so far. There's a whole deep set of philosophy that you can look at on that.
We have time for one more question.
I'm curious about Ann's question.
Okay.
Working in the space.
Two more questions.
Thanks. I have a question about the anti-debate format. Two mini questions. One is for you two, and one is for, I know, sorry, I'm just going to sneak them in. One question is for you two. I'm curious what the felt sense was for you when you moved from the kind of traditional debate format into the synthesis mode. Was it uncomfortable? Was it deflating? Was it liberating? Like, what was it like to shift and to kind of have to kind of release your own position to some extent and begin to integrate the other? I'm just really curious what that felt like.
I personally, Stephanie and I talk about this a lot. I deeply resonate with like the theory of change behind what Stephanie's trying to do. I think we live in a world that's so entrenched in positions, and then we have formats that reify those. Like, because I'm speaking to an audience, I have to win. So I deeply appreciate formats that push us to figure out, well, are we actually disagreeing? Like, where do we disagree? And so like the experience of being in dialogue, I found much more fulfilling. Of course, in this particular debate, I think it took me a while, I don't know if it was the same for you, to even figure out how, because we were just talking about like two different layers of the stack, and figuring out where those layers met took a lot of time. But I find that much more rewarding. I'm curious about your thoughts.
I felt relief. There's something tragic about watching your mind implement the category of confirmation bias that you think is most insidious.
Yeah, totally.
I love that.
Nice.
That's well said.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I noticed that there was like in the first segment almost like a ramping up, and then there was almost like a softening that seemed like it happened.
Yeah, there's this sense that there's the sophistry and there's the reality, and somehow allowing oneself to experience reality even for a moment. Yeah.
Thank you. And just a really quick question for Stephanie. I'm just curious, like, what other topics, like, assuming you're planning to continue anti-debate, like, what future topics will you be exploring?
Yeah. It's funny, someone today, because there was one I didn't plan for the two to be the same week and the same topic, but someone today was like, oh, is the anti-debate on tour? I was like, yeah, it's on tour. That's what's going on. So, yes, ones that are forthcoming. So we'll be doing one around the release of the AI doc, so if you just can't get enough of anti-debate about AI, featuring people from the film, and in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that is coming up. I'm working with a few different podcasts. I'm basically giving it to the world right now, in the process of giving it to the world. So I'm doing a few, and then I hopefully won't have to do them anymore. Or I would be happy to do them, but the idea is to make it available and have other people know that it exists. Because right now, when a podcast host or an educator wants to engage diverse perspectives in a productive way, the main tool that they have to reach for is a debate. And so we are wanting to make something else available. So doing some live events, working with some podcasts. One of them is called Uncomfortable Conversations. It's one of Substack's biggest world politics podcasts. Glenn Greenwald might be involved in that one. I'm working with Kainos. It's a platform in the UK. So doing some live events, working with some podcasts. Right now fundraising to roll it out further. I would love to do it at TEDx at universities. That would just be such a beautiful way to get it into a university context. The one that I'm the most excited about actually is, so I mentioned that the term anti-debate was coined by William McCaskill, so he will be participating in an anti-debate in a couple of weeks, and he was so excited that this idea that he just put out there almost 10 years ago has now been brought to life, and he is based at Oxford, and he wants to bring it to Oxford, which is like the cultural home of classic debate. For that one, I would love to have him moderate, but that would be, yeah, so that's one that I'm especially excited about. And beyond that, you know, the possibilities are wide open. You could imagine a podcast that is just anti-debates, you know, just on all the topics. Let's do it, an event series, a game. Like, I could imagine a game that turns, you know, these practices of steel manning, of red teaming, and synthesis into a fun social activity, a game show. Liv Bory wants to turn it into a game show. So the possibilities are wide open, and if you'd like to help bring them to life, be in touch.
Oh, Imran, I'm dying to know what your question is, but now that we've come out of the substance and into the anti-debate, that felt like the closer, and we're at 9 o'clock, but I want to hear it. What did you...
We can do one more question, and then I'll close this out. Yes.
Do you want to do one more?
Sure, I'll do a quick one.
It'll be worth it.
Well, with apologies to both Daniel and Jeremy, like, to caricature both of your views, it sounds like, Daniel, you're saying, would you really want to let everyone have a nuclear reactor or like a genetics lab in their home? And Jeremy, you're saying, would you not want everyone have writing? And is the disagreement you're having fundamentally about the kind of the ultimate potential of technology rather than open source? Like, is that the kind of the crux of it? Or am I misunderstanding?
Well, I think you're right on that. When we were deciding on the topic for tonight, the toss-up came down as open source, because the question of like what is the incision point between our two different views, I'm not sure that open source. I think it's a fine topic for us to start the conversation, right? But I'm not sure if we were to replay it that it's the proximate, like the biggest leverage disagreement between where we sit. I think, to rephrase what you're saying, my biggest contention is that we're nowhere near prepared for this world, and that we should be very, very quickly trying to figure out the language for the world we're stepping into before it shapes us. Like, if you look back, I know everyone uses the social media analogy, but I'm going to do it anyway, because it's not that AI is like social media in a deep mirror sense, but it's the same thing that happened as we had all these beautiful promises of the way that social media was going to change the world, and then you could see from that vantage that it was too dogmatic, that it was too unrestrained, that it wasn't thinking in a complexity-aware way, and that by the time we developed a language for how it was going to shape us, it already did all the violence to our civil society, to our politics, to our institutions, and that had we had the 2025 foresight, we would have taken different steps to make sure that went differently, and we could have had a drastically different 20-teens. Like, that's what I'm afraid of now, and I think probably the biggest difference is that it seems like you're worried more about getting caught in the stagnant or the corrupt or the centralized power world, and I'm more afraid of us doing a ton of damage to ourselves before we figure out what world we actually wanted to build.
Yeah, I think those fears that you describe in mine are accurate from a fears perspective, but actually I just frame myself as a deeply optimistic person, and so I don't think nearly as much in terms of fears as in terms of agentic opportunism, and how, you know, I personally can see perhaps somebody in the audience to invent something of substance that pushes us in the direction of the future we actually wish existed. And I think there's actually a really sort of dangerous aspect of the agentic worldview, which is I often will have beliefs that are a function of my own personal capabilities, that are a function of my life specifically. And so it isn't always the case when I tell you something that I'm describing a belief I believe you all should have necessarily. It is a belief that allows me to invent something new, perhaps. And that's a really personal, kind of belief. Beliefs have different objective functions. Sometimes the society is your utility function, but sometimes the objective of your belief is that you can do something special or different that nobody else would be capable of doing. And because you have this belief, you can do it. And so I think it's important to try to understand what's incentivizing me to believe something, and perhaps maintain the space of all of the perspectives or all of the incentive structures. Oh, if I had this incentive structure, here's what I would believe, right? As opposed to it being identity-centric. So yeah, when you say, oh, it's as though, writing versus, he said, oh, we shouldn't have nukes in your basement. I think both of them are important mischaracterizations. I think he is actually much less focused on existential risk than he is on these sort of more subtle societal impacts that are, almost more social media-esque. So I don't know if that's accurate. Yeah, but basically the degradation of important societal processes is a very different category of objection to open source than we can build bioweapons. And, I guess I argued it's easy to do that, with non-open source models too. So it's unclear that that's like a fulcrum with open source at the center of it. And then my perspective on writing, I think is, I think AI is much more important than writing. And that maybe is a controversial position, but I think it is plausible that it can go beyond anything we could have ever conceived of. And we don't yet know whether that will happen or not. And I think that it's also plausible that we as a society will be transformed in deeper ways than we can currently comprehend.
Okay. So they're going to be anti-debating all night long. So if you want to stay here. Okay, so yes, I'm going to close this out. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to the portal for hosting us. To find out about future anti-debates or use it yourself, you can go to anti-debate.org. The Anti-Debate is a project of Synthesis Media, a nonprofit production studio devoted to expanding hearts and minds. And may we, use our different perspectives on our most important issues, not to further divide us, but to see those issues with greater complexity.
Thank you, Steph.
Thank you.